Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to be linking to a discussion on the Big Blue Metafilter that deals with dystopian and post-apocalyptic novels, specifically talking about the young adult genre, but the discussion gets much broader than that, and as is normal, there's a lot of really good content on Metafilter. There's a high signal-to-noise ratio on Metafilter that I happen to really love. And someone brings up a really good point of some of the reasons that YA dystopian and post-apocalyptic settings are so popular, and why we are seeing less of the positive future like Star Trek than we did in the past. Most of the YA stuff, of course, is young adults, and young adults, people under the 18 in particular, are living in many ways in a dystopian future because they have constraints upon their actions for logical reasons. They can't go out and do anything they want. They have parental structures. Whether those parental structures are biological, adopted, foster care, what have you, there are restraints upon their actions. So books that deal with being freed from those constraints in either a dystopian or post-apocalyptic setting have a certain attraction, because suddenly they are no longer being restrained. They can go out and do the things in a fanciful way that they can't in real life. And of course it's perfectly safe because it all takes place in here and on the page. So they can experiment with the speculation of those kinds of adventures that they can't in real life. And authors have gotten particularly good at tailoring stories to that demographic, though it's not new. I mean, let's face it, Heinlein and Bradbury did the same thing 50 and 60 years ago. Okay, this is not a new concept. It's just being marketed to a new audience, and particularly they're getting a lot more women into this whole demographic than there used to be, which is really refreshing because it's allowing a more holistic world where you have both male and female characters, and it isn't so aimed at straight white males, which is refreshing, really, frankly. I don't read fiction any longer, but just the fact that there are people out there who can identify with these characters. I saw an article recently about, well, it wasn't an article, but it's a piece about the fact that someone had taken their autistic sibling to go see Guardians of the Galaxy. And he was thrilled because he identified with Drax, because Drax views the world literally without metaphors. And this autistic kid views the world literally without metaphors. So he was able to identify with that character in a way that he had never been able to identify with another character this way before. At least not in a big blockbuster, action film. He was so thrilled, so enamored of that. It made him so happy. When you can identify with a character in your preferred fiction, that's a wonderfully liberating concept. But one of the reasons that we're talking about the fact that we don't have as much positive Star Trek style futurism, even though Star Trek goes through a post-apocalyptic phase in the canon, at least one of the canons, it is a very positive post-consumer, post-scarcity universe. The reason we're not seeing that is that we are pretty much living a cyberpunk present. It's not the future anymore, folks. We are living in cyberpunk. If you've read or played any cyberpunk games back in the 80s and the 90s, the future they postulated is now. And it's just as depressing now as it was when it was discussed back in the 80s and the 90s. When it was a twisted reflection of the Reagan era. When it was the Reagan era cranked to 11. Well, that's what we're living in now. We're living in the Reagan era cranked to 11. We're living in a world with huge economic disparity. With huge grabs by the wealthy. With governments becoming more totalitarian. With corporations becoming more fluid and moving from place to place, where capital can go anywhere while labor is tied to its market, because we are real people living in homes and communities, and we cannot be as fluid as can capital. So we are living in the cyberpunk present, which is both fascinating and depressing at the same time. I compare with Gravity Falls, I think it was, when the main character was talking about having a mobile phone and having no connection to a landline. That was futuristic to me. And now I live it. I have no landline. My mother-in-law downstairs has no landline. We are untethered. I still have a cable line, but that's because it's a better internet access than a satellite dish. It's more reliable. But with better and better online internet access, that could eventually break that as well. At the moment, I don't want that additional cost. I don't have internet access through my phone. Those who know me, my phone is a dumb phone. It does nothing but make phone calls. But the post-apocalyptic books are very popular, but I prefer mine to be beyond the actual apocalypse. I don't want to watch films, television series, or read books, or even necessarily read games that take place during the apocalypse. And there's a reason for this. If you put me into those settings, I will then project myself into those settings. My anxiety, while far under more control than it was in the past, will latch onto that like Velcro. And it will pull me in. And I will spend literal hours and days of my life obsessing over how would I make it through this world? How would I survive? Could I survive? And that isn't healthy for me. That kind of predictive anxiety cycle is unhealthy for me for my own anxiety. Because part of my anxiety issues is that I am making foreclusions. I am looking into the future and say, well, that I would fail miserably at that without even trying it. Or becoming obsessed with something and convince myself that is my future when in actuality the future is unknown. And I love the word foreclusion. I wish I could remember where I read it. It's an awesome, awesome term. But that's part of my anxiety. So thrusting me into a setting that takes place where I would theoretically be alive is really disturbing for me. And in fact, the only zombie apocalypse setting that I have read in the last decade, and it was a graphic novel, so I don't read fiction any longer, at least not novels, short stories, things like that, was The Abandoned. Because in The Abandoned, everyone beyond the age of 23 dies and then rises. I turned 50 this week. So, not having to worry about me being a survivor in that setting. Oddly, I found myself speculating what would happen to my poor cats. Still, even in a setting that liberates me from the anxiety of having to project myself into a survival situation, I am still concerned about my pets and the pets of everyone else. And the animals in zoos. The animals in the farms a lot less, because they have a much better chance of getting out. Of course, the world itself would be thrilled. I mean, the planet would just, hey, humans are gone! Awesome! But I don't want to be projecting myself into that. It feeds into my anxiety. Now, you give me a post-apocalyptic setting that is far after the point where I would be here. Say the post-apocalypse doesn't happen until a point after I would be dead. Naturally, so it takes place in 2090 or in the 22nd century or 23rd century, like the Gamma World settings. I don't have a problem with it. That's fantasy, folks. It doesn't involve me. So I can get myself really into the Mutant Epoch, Gamma World, hopefully Warlords of the Apocalypse someday. Wouldn't that be special? I actually get the game I pre-ordered, I don't even remember how many years ago. But, those are safe. Because I won't be here. I'm not going to worry about how my wife makes it through or how my pets make it through. None of us are here. No one I personally know right now in this world was probably going to be alive when those worlds happen. Maybe a couple of the people I know, kids, would make it at the end of this century. They might make it into the beginning of the next one. Alright? particularly if life expectancy goes out to 100 years, which could be quite possible. I mean, my wife's grandmother's 99. She'll be 100 in January. So I prefer my post-apocalyptic settings far in the future, long after I'm here. Either the breakdown happens now and the game or a novel takes place, or the film in the far future, or the apocalypse itself takes place long after my death. It's one of the reasons I haven't seen the latest X-Men movie, because I don't want to look at the America destroyed. I just don't want to see that right now. My anxiety is not under enough control to make that a viable experience that I would enjoy. It's why I never want to see the films 28 days later or 28 weeks later, because I would live through that experience. And I think that the people in the films did things that were absolutely sane, besides the fact that diseases don't work that way. That's a different topic. I've covered it before. People disagree with me. What a shock. People disagree with me. So I'm asking you folks a question, or questions, because I'm a nosy guy. Do you think we're actually living in the cyberpunk present? What type of post-apocalyptic setting do you like? Whether it's in a TV series, a novel, graphic novel, role-playing game, what have you. Do you like the idea of thrusting yourself into that? Of postulating how would you make it through this? Or do you, like me, prefer to think of them far in the future, long after you're gone, so you're not going to have to worry about the stress of postulating how am I going to make it through, or how my pets are going to make it through, or how the zoo animals are going to make it through, that kind of thing. Because I think this, in some ways, is a personality test. In some ways, this reveals who we are and what we want in life, which is cool. So, tell me, what do you like in your cyberpunk present or your post-apocalyptic settings? Are you into dystopian YA novels? Regardless of your age, people can enjoy novels of any stripe. I mean, there are people enjoying Heinlein and Bradbury stories that were written for adolescents who are now retired. That were but they were adolescents when those stories were written. So time does not matter when it comes to a story. A myth is a myth regardless of when it's told, or how old you are when you first hear it. So I want to know, what do you like in these topics?